Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss the Doberman Gang from 1972, starring Byron Mabe, Hal Reed, Julie Parrish, Simi Bao, and Jojo Demore, directed by Byron Ross Chudhow. Now, I haven't seen this movie before once in my life, but it was requested to me by a friend of mine whom I'm not going to say his name for identity protection purposes. So and there are sequels to this movie as well as a remake that will eventually come out, which maybe I'll get there to the other sequels if the remake is closer to coming out. And let's get into the movie. We open with a robbery set up by Eddie, played by Byron Mabe, Jojo, played by Jojo Demore, and Sammy, played by Simi Bao, as they rob a bank and almost get in the wrong car and blow the heist as Eddie blames himself and kicks them out and figures out a way to pull off a more successful heist. And these characters feel like amateurs, as the whole heist thing, as it feels telegraphed for me. For example, Eddie sees a few robbers trying to rob a car until they get encountered and trapped by a type of dog called Doberman something. I forget the second word, which can. Well, I'm going to call them Dobermans for the rest of the show. But in case you don't know what I'm referring to, they're like black and brown dogs, which can be some of the meanest dogs I've seen. Not all of them, but some. And get arrested by somehow they get caught by the cops, which isn't funny to me. Eddie tells a woman he's thinking about getting some dogs, as he doesn't know what they are, but he goes to the pet shop learning about Dobermans as he goes to the army pretending to be a journalist and plans on interviewing an ex military man named Barney Greer, played by Hal Reed, and hired him as his partner. And Eddie looks around the bank to figure out how to rob them, which feels like an Ocean's 11 ripoff, the original, not the remake. As Eddie finds a quiet ranch to get for the robbery, along with Sammy, Jojo, and his girlfriend June, played by Julie Parrish, as this is badly acted as the original Ocean's 11, in my opinion. Barney arrives at the location of Eddie and introduces himself to June, as the score felt very early 1970s in a mediocre kind of way. I don't care about that, which isn't always the best thing, as Eddie takes Barney, to the house and gets introduced to Sammy and Jojo to Barney as he and June train the dogs, and she knows about dogs. And Barney recommends bringing in 6 dogs, and Eddie wants him to train Doberman doggies, as he only works with shepherds. And the next day comes, and Sammy and Jojo brings the Dobermans as well as a bulldog named J. Edgar Hoover, like the director of the FBI back in 1924, to the time this movie came out, as they trained the dogs to be robbers like them. And the theme song to this movie starts playing, and I like the training montage, but so far this movie isn't really impressing me all that much. 1 month later, Eddie and Barney trains the dogs to bark, attack, and work together with Jojo, as Barney is worried about how they might turn on him, as we move on to Eddie going to the bank while June isn't going to the laundromat. And eventually Eddie joins June at the laundromat, and the dialogue said by the actors with the writing written by the writers felt rather awkward, as Eddie gives the dogs names as he checks on them while checking up on his setup and the bank. And Barney is upset about how they stole the dogs and is not interested in robbing banks and wants to train the dogs himself. And he leaves and figures out how Eddie wants to put down the dogs after the robbery, as this is so far a dumb movie that fails to make me laugh. Eddie plans the heist on how the dogs takes every dollar of the money in the bank, while Barney comes back to work for Eddie. And Eddie thinks about what to write on the note as he tells Barney to train the dogs to get back home from the bank, as Barney thinks about continuing the job and how to bring back the dogs with the whistle for dogs, which will come back a few minutes later in this movie, as they're called the dogs based on their color types of whistles. But the training montages are the best thing about the movie, in my opinion, but it's not saying much. The Dobermans attack J. Edgar Hoover, the dog, as a training exercise, which feels sad, as that's not a way to train your dog. And this is when the movie is sending the wrong message to audiences that have dogs to be as aggressive, while June wants to know her half the payment. And Eddie says the payment is just between the four guys, and she talks him into giving her 15% of the payment, which is cringy dialogue. And next day comes, and June chats with Barney about his past until she starts to kiss Barney, as his crush would have appreciated for who he is. And the guys have a good laugh until June is disrespected by Eddie. And at this point, I don't like the characters at this point in the movie. Eddie becomes aggressive towards Barney while training the dogs for the robbery, and they go in a Volkswagen and proceed on the robbery from a distance, and the dogs don't do it right, and they call them back, and Eddie demands Barney to train the dogs harder than he did, because they're not prepared, and wait for another couple of days to pull off a successful heist, as they do it again, and money bags on the dogs, as the dogs are on the way to the bank, and they arrive and successfully enter the bank while Sammy and Jojo leave a trail for the dogs to get home. And June figures out and says to Eddie he'll want to get rid of not just the dogs, but his partners, and as well as the janitor tells the bank manager there are dogs in the bank, until he goes to a security guard. And I thought, Mr. Bank Manager, pay attention to someone alerting you, which is stupid enough as it is. Barney leaves the robbers behind, and they call the dogs to do the job as a banker named Sandy, as she receives a note to do the right thing for the robbers so nobody can get hurt. And the bank puts out the money in the bags that the dogs are carrying, with a customer almost oncoming until a dog scares them away, which was kind of stupid, and the score bothered me while the robbery happens, while Eddie gets out, and as the movie feels like we're watching it in a 35mm film print, which I do like, but at the same time it was pretty distracting, as June calls the dogs out of the bank and runs back home, and June leaves the building across the street, and while the dogs get home, one dog gets ran over by a car and killed, as another one gets a part of the money. And one of the dogs smells a chained up doggy, and Eddie gets back to the ranch, and June drives with J. Edgar Hoover the doggy, as everybody sees the dogs coming back to the ranch. And as the dogs get back, June blows the whistle to tell the dogs to attack Eddie, Sammy, and Jojo, and to come to June herself, as Eddie, Sammy, and Jojo lose their money, and all comes to June, and the doggies come to June and lay down until June almost gets the money, and the dog growls at her and bark at June from taking the money, as does J. Edgar Hoover. And the dogs go with J. Edgar Hoover, the doggy, and the climax felt like a betrayal, as this movie was super dumb. But how dumb was this movie? Let's talk about the rating and get into it. I'll give this movie a 3.9 out of 10. The characters felt like amateurs at the whole heist thing, as it feels telegraphed in my opinion, as this movie isn't really funny to me, as it feels updated, and rumor has it there's a remake coming out there eventually, as this feels like a ripoff of the original Ocean's 11. Not the remake, as they're both pretty bad movies in my opinion, as they're equally as bad acted. The score felt very early 1970s, which is around the same time this movie came out, in a mediocre way, which isn't always the best thing, despite there were a few things I liked, but I wasn't impressed by the movie at best. And the dialogue said by the actors and the writing written by the writers felt rather awkward. This is a dumb movie that fails to make me laugh, as none of this is funny to me, which felt very sad for me, as the climax was just stupid, and unfortunately I have to go with a non-recommendation for this movie. But don't get me wrong, the training montages are the best thing about the movie in my opinion, which isn't saying much, but the reason I can't recommend this to anybody is this is a movie about training dogs to become abusive while robbing banks, which doesn't sound like a good message when it comes to man's best friend. And I had a dog once that I did my best training on not to be aggressive to anyone, and she was a sweet doggy, but at the end of the day, she was chicken of people. But yeah, this sends out the wrong message on how to train your dog. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me for this review. And until then, if we ever get that remake and I'll come back for the sequels, let's get to the man's best friend and public enemy number one.